The mud was cold. That was the first thing Rosalind Vane noticed. Not the shame. Not the 200 faces circled around her in the village square. Just the cold, seeping through the thin fabric of her dress and into her knees, the way winter always found the poor first. She kept her eyes down, because looking up meant meeting them. The neighbors who'd borrowed her father's grain in the lean years and never paid it back. The women who whispered behind their hands at the well. Her own sisters standing near the front, arms folded, faces arranged into that particular expression of sorrow that fooled no one and delighted everyone. Look at her, Hedda Vane's voice carried. It always did. Her mother had a way of pitching every word so the last person in the crowd could hear it, could taste it. 27 years old. And so desperate she married a vagrant. The crowd murmured, pleased, fed. Rosa breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, slow the way she'd taught herself as a girl. A trick to keep from crying, because tears only made Hedda sharper, sweeter, crueler. Rosa had learned that before she learned to read. Tell them, her mother said, circling now the hem of her good dress, the only good dress the Vanes owned, and of course Hedda wore it, dragging a clean line through the dirt. Tell them how you gave yourself to a drifter. A man who wandered in 3 months ago with nothing but thin clothes and a tired horse. 3 months. Rosa's chest tightened around the number because it was true, and because it was the truest thing she owned now. Tell them how you disgraced this family. Bound yourself to him under the moon. No permission. No witnesses. Not even a word to your own mother. A hiss ran through the gathered wolves. Hand-fasting. The old way. Binding under wolf law, yes, but scorned by anyone who called themselves civilized. Primitive. The sort of thing done in the far territories where people still ate with their hands and buried their dead standing up. Rosa felt the heat crawl up her neck. She would not give it to them. She would not. Where is he then? A man's voice from somewhere near the smithy. This mountain husband of yours. Run off, did he? The moment things turned hard. Laughter. And Rosa almost laughed too. A small broken thing caught in her throat. Because they were probably right. Because nothing good in her life had ever been allowed to stay. Because she'd spent 27 years learning that happiness was alone, and the collector always came. So she waited to feel him gone. Except the crowd began to part. She heard it before she understood it. The shift of bodies, the murmur-changing key. And then footsteps steady, unhurried, carrying a weight that seemed to press the very air down around them. She knew those footsteps. Her heart, that traitor, stuttered. He came through the hostile crowd, with his shoulders square and his weathered face showing nothing. His pale hair was pulled back with a strip of leather. Worn vest, simple boots, hands scarred from work. Torvald. Tor she'd called him in the soft dark of their 2 rooms. To everyone here, he was nobody. A man with nothing to offer but labor and empty promises. But his eyes found hers, and in them she saw the man who'd fixed her roof and asked for nothing, who'd carried water when the rope had torn her palms open, who'd sat with her by firelight and made her laugh, actually laugh out loud, a sound she'd forgotten she could make. She saw the man who'd made her feel human again. So you came back, Hedda said, sweetness dripping off every syllable like poison off a knife. I thought you'd be halfway to the next village by now. That's what men like you do, isn't it? When the fun runs out. Tor didn't answer. He walked to where Rosa knelt, and he held out his hand. Get up, he said. Quiet. Only for her, though the whole square heard it. "You don't kneel for anyone." Rosa stared at the hand, scarred, steady, open, and something inside her that had been holding itself very still for a very long time cracked. She placed her hand in his. He pulled her to her feet. The crowd went quiet. Then the particular quiet of people who came to see one thing and are watching another take its place. Rosa stood, mud on her knees and her chin lifting 1 degree at a time until she was looking her mother in the eye. And Hedda, for just a breath, looked away first. To understand how a poor woman ended up kneeling in a village square, you have to go back 3 months. Before the roof, before the water, before the man with the tired horse. You have to understand what it was to be a Vane. The Vanes had been merchants once. That was the story. Rosa grew up inside the way some children grow up inside a house. You don't see the walls. You just know where they are. Her father Alden had traded in wool and salt and river passage, and there had been a time before Rosa's memory began when the Vane name meant something at the market gates. Then it didn't. A bad season. A worse partner. A shipment lost to the spring floods, and a debt that swallowed the rest. By the time Rosa was old enough to understand money, there wasn't any. What remained was the shape of pride with nothing inside it. A good dress, a family name, and a mother who could not forgive the world for making her ordinary. So Hedda found someone else to blame. Rosa was the eldest. Rosa was there. Rosa did not fight back because fighting back cost more than swallowing it, and she'd done the arithmetic young. She raised her sisters. Perrin first, then Wyla, both of them soft-handed and sharp-tongued, in the way of girls who've been told they're the pretty ones. She managed the household. She hauled the water and mended the mending, and stretched 1 loaf into 3 days, and lay awake doing sums that never came out right. And she was told in 100 ways every week that she was the reason. The burden, the old maid, the disappointment with her father's eyes. She believed it. That was the thing no one ever understood about cruelty. You didn't just hear it. You learned it. It became the floor you stood on. Until a man showed up with a tired horse and started very slowly to pull the floor out from under her. She'd been carrying water the first time she saw him. 2 buckets, 1 in each hand, the rope handles biting into palms already raw. The afternoon sun sat low and gold over Ashmere, and Rosa's arms were shaking, and she was thinking about nothing at all, except getting to the door before the ache won. "Those look heavy." She nearly dropped everything. A man stood at the bend in the road. Tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested work, not comfort. His hair was pale, near white in the low sun, and his face was lined and unbothered, and his eyes were a strange pale blue, the color of ice over deep water. "Can I help?" he said. "I don't need help." It came out fast, sharp, a reflex worn smooth by years. "Thank you. I'm sure you're capable." He didn't move toward her, didn't loom, just stood easy as if he had all the time in the world and no particular use for it. Capable doesn't mean you have to struggle when someone's offering. Rosa hesitated, because no one offered, not without a reckoning attached. "I'm new," he said. "Just arrived. Figured I'd do a good turn before I ask around for work." She looked at him properly then, the dust of the road on him. The horse she could see now tied at the rail by the storehead down and weary. A wanderer, the kind that drifted through in the spring and drifted out by autumn, harmless, mostly useless usually. "You're looking for work," she said. Not quite a question. "Anything honest. Repairs. Labor. Name's Torvald. Tor." She glanced down at her own hands, the red rope marks, the old calluses under the new, and she was so tired. "Rosa," she said finally. And then, because if he was going to be around, he'd learn it anyway. "The Vane house is this way. That's where these are headed." She let him take the buckets. He carried them the way a normal man carries a heavy load. Careful. A little effort in the set of his jaw. What Rosa did not know, could not know, was that he could have carried 4 times that weight without a change in his breathing. That the effort was a performance. That everything about him down to the iron collar half hidden beneath his own collar was a lie built to keep a secret so large it could have flattened the whole village. She didn't know she was walking beside a king. She only knew that for the length of one dusty road, she wasn't carrying the water alone. Here is the part of the story he could never have told her. His name was Aldrich Thorne. He was 42 years old, and he had ruled the mountain kingdom of Valemore for 2 decades, and until the moment he'd seen a woman struggling with 2 water buckets, he had thought his own wolf was dead. Not dead. Sleeping. So long and so deep that he'd stopped waiting for it to wake. The council had pressed him for years. Take a Luna. Secure the line. The lesser packs grow restless. They see a king without a mate, and they wonder if the old blood has run thin. They meant well. They were not wrong. But he had refused every female they'd paraded before him. Refused them not out of pride, but because his wolf had turned its face from everyone silent, uninterested, asleep. Then on the last full moon, he had felt a pull, faint, north and west. A thread stretched so thin he could barely hold it. He'd told his beta hour that it was probably nothing. Decades alone did strange things to a man's instincts. But there had also been a mission, real urgent, dangerous. Reports from the northern border. Human hunters seen where no hunter should be. Rogue wolves moving through territories without asking leave. And whispers ugly ones that Alpha Corwin Voss had opened his lands to the hunters, that a treaty 3 centuries old was being quietly gutted from the inside. A king could not investigate that with a royal escort. Everyone performs for a crown. So Aldrich had done what his ancestors would have called reckless, and his enemies would call impossible. He'd taken off the crown. He'd put on an iron collar enchanted to smother his royal scent and cage the crushing weight of his alpha aura. He'd announced a month of sacred solitude, the silent moon, an old rite unquestioned. He'd dressed like a wanderer and ridden north into the poor territories. Alone following a thread, he told himself, was nothing. The thread had led him to Ashmere, and to a woman with rope-torn hands. The moment he saw her, the sleeping thing in his chest did not stir. It surged. It came awake, all at once, roaring, nearly staggering him where he stood, and the collar caught the outward signs and swallowed them. But inside every instinct he owned was screaming a single word he had waited 42 years to feel, and never once believed he would. Mate. The pull hadn't been nothing. The pull had been her. Rosa did not know any of this. Rosa only knew that the wanderer stayed. He set the buckets down in her overgrown yard and looked up at the sagging roof with a builder's eye. "That thatch won't last the winter," he said. "Frame's likely rotted underneath." "I know." She didn't meet his eyes. "I've been trying to save to hire someone." "I could fix it." She turned. "I don't have money for repairs." "I'm not asking for money." He said it plainly, no angle in it. "I need a reputation if I want steady work. A good job where people can see it, that's worth more than coins. It was a reasonable thing to say. Practical. The kind a traveling laborer might genuinely mean. It was also not the truth. The truth was that his wolf would not let him walk away. But he could not say that, so he said the other thing, the almost true thing, and Rosa, who had spent her whole life learning to hear the reckoning hidden inside every kindness, listened for it, and couldn't find it. "Why me?" she asked. "Why help me specifically?" "Because you're mine," his wolf snarled. "Because I have waited my entire life to find you. Because," he said slowly, "you look like someone who's been carrying heavy things alone for a long time." A pause. "Figured maybe it's time somebody helped carry one." Something moved behind her ribs. Surprise, or the ghost of it. Their strangeness of being seen. Before she could answer, a voice cut from inside the house, Hedda sharp as a struck flint. "Rosalind, where have you been? Those buckets were due an hour ago." The warmth drained from Rosa's face. He watched it go. Watched resignation slide down over her like a shutter closing. "I have to go," she said. "Thank you for the offer." She went inside. The door shut with a soft final sound, the sound Aldrich thought of a cell locking. And he stood in the yard, listening to the voices rise on the other side of the wall. A woman berating. A girl apologizing. The song sung by people who should have cherished her, and had chosen instead to make her small. His hands closed into fists. The iron collar had never felt so much like a chain. The days after that fell into a shape. Tor came each morning with borrowed tools. He tore out the rotted thatch and hauled up new. He reinforced the beams. He rehung shutters that hadn't closed right in years, so that for the first time in Rosa's memory, the wind didn't find its way into the kitchen at night. She watched him warily at first, waiting for the demand, the turn. The moment the kindness revealed its price. It never came. He simply worked. And slowly, without quite deciding to, she began to linger when she brought him the midday cup. A few words about the weather, about the repairs. Small, inconsequential things that somehow did not feel small at all. She learned he'd traveled far, that he was easy with silence, that he actually listened the way almost no one did, leaning into her words, as if they were worth the leaning. And Aldrich learned her. He learned she was 27, though the weariness aged her past it, that the clan had fallen when her father's trade collapsed, and she'd been raising her sisters and running the house since she was barely more than a child herself. He learned that she loved to read, but never had the hours for it, that the forest was the one place she went to breathe, that she carried small kindnesses inside her, like seeds waiting for the right soil, and no one had ever thought to water them. With every conversation, the certainty in his chest settled deeper. This was not attraction. It was not even the simple recognition of a mate. This was the other half of his own soul, hidden in the last place on earth anyone would think to look. It was on a washing day that Rosa found the thing that changed everything. Tor had torn his sleeve on a nail badly, and she'd offered to mend it, and he'd shrugged the vest off and handed it over, the way a man hands over something he doesn't think twice about. She'd sat by the window with her needle working the tear closed, and her fingers had brushed something stiff sewn into the lining near the hem. Not a coin. Flat, cool, metal. She should have left it. She didn't, because Rosa had spent her whole life reading the shape of hidden things, and her fingers were already working the little seam loose before her mind caught up to what her hands were doing. Out slid a disk of silver, heavy, old, cold, in a way that seemed to have nothing to do with the weather. and pressed into its face, worn smooth at the edges by handling, was the figure of a wolf mid-stride, head high, ringed by markings she didn't recognize, but somehow felt she should. A seal. The kind of seal a man carried when his word was law somewhere. Rosa sat very still. Because a drifter did not carry silver. A drifter with silver would have spent it or sold it, or been robbed of it long ago on some dark road. A drifter did not sew it into his lining where no one would look. Except a man who was not a drifter. Except a man hiding something. Her heart was going fast now, and her mind was going faster, running ahead of her, down roads she didn't want to walk. Who was he? Who was he really? What did it mean that he'd come here to nothing, to nowhere to her? What did it mean that of all the yards in all the poor villages of the north, he'd chosen this one to make himself useful in? She stopped. She made herself stop. And then, and she would think about this, later would turn it over for weeks, she did not confront him. She did not run to him and hold out the seal and demand answers. She slid it back into the lining. She closed the seam with small even stitches, the way she'd closed 1,000 seams, and she handed him back the vest, and she smiled, and she said nothing. Because Rosa Vane had learned something else in 27 years, something crueler and more useful than she'd ever wanted to know, that the fastest way to lose a good thing was to grab at it. So she watched, and she waited, and she carried the secret of his secret quietly, the way she carried everything alone. She just no longer carried it blind. The gossip started in the 6th week. It was the way these things always started, a silence where there'd been chatter. 2 women at the well who stopped talking when Rosa approached and started again lower when she passed. A look at the market. A whisper that died on the wind. She was spending, they said, an inappropriate amount of time with a man who had no family, no property, no prospects. It looked desperate. It looked worse than desperate. Her sister Wyla appeared at the cottage 3 days later, and her face wore that mix of concern and satisfaction that Rosa knew like the back of her own hand. "Mother's heard," Wyla said, without a greeting. "About you and the drifter." Rosa's hands went still over the bread dough. "There's nothing to hear. That's not what people are saying." Wyla examined her nails. "They're saying a woman of 27, unmarried, spending her days alone with a man like that. They say, we all know what she's after." The word landed exactly where it was aimed. Desperate. As if loneliness were so shameful that even accepting kindness became a thing to be ashamed of. "He's been good to me," Rosa said quietly. "I won't apologize for that." "Good." Wyla's laugh was sharp and pretty like her. "Men aren't good without wanting something back, Rosa. You're old enough to know that." After she left, Rosa stood alone in the kitchen with flour to her wrists and felt the old weight settle onto her shoulders. The judgment, the knowing, the certainty of a whole village that she was less than and always would be. But under it, new and small and stubborn, something else stirred. Because for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen worth. And she found to her own surprise that she was not willing to let them take it back. He found her that evening in the little garden behind the house, tearing weeds up by the root, with more force than the weeds required. He didn't ask what was wrong. He crouched beside her close enough to speak low, far enough not to crowd. "Your mother spoke to you," he said. "My mother has opinions about my life." She ripped up another weed, most of them unkind. "I'd stay away." Quiet, steady. "If it would make things easier, I don't want to be the reason things get harder for you." Her hand stopped. She looked at him, and there was something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not weariness, not fear. Something with an edge to it. "Do you want to stay away?" "No," he admitted. "Then why?" she said, and her voice climbed just slightly. "Does everyone else's opinion of us matter more than what either of us actually feels?" The question hung in the dusk between them, loaded with everything neither of them had said. Inside his chest, the wolf strained against the collar's magic, demanding he tell her, demanding he tear the iron off and let her feel what he felt. The bond he could sense, and she could not. But he held it. Because rushing this would break it. Because she deserved to choose him, with her eyes open, not to be swept off her feet by a power she hadn't agreed to. So instead, he reached out and covered her dirt-stained hand with his. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Not to me. But you should understand what you'd be choosing. The gossip gets worse. Your family pushes harder. The village judges you more. I can carry their opinion of me. You're the one who'd bleed for it." Rosa looked down at their joined hands. "What if I told you," she said slowly, "that their judgment is nothing next to how alone I was before you came?" His breath caught. "What if I said I'd rather face their cruelty, with you standing next to me, than face their pity by myself?" For a long moment, he couldn't speak. The most powerful wolf in the northern kingdoms, and a poor woman's honesty, had struck him dumb. "Then I'd say, he managed that you're braver than anyone in this village deserves." She smiled, small, fragile, but real all the way to her eyes. "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm just tired of being afraid." They sat there while the twilight deepened around them, and the first stars came out cold and clear over Ashmere. Two people choosing each other in a world that had decided long before either of them that they weren't allowed to. And Rosa, her hand warm inside his thought about the silver seal sewn into his lining. She thought, "I don't know who you are." She thought, not really, not all of it. But then he turned his head and looked at her, and in the last of the light, his pale eyes were steady and open and unafraid, and she found she didn't care in that moment what the seal meant. She'd spent a lifetime being told what she was worth by people who'd never once bothered to look at her. And here was a stranger who'd done nothing but look. Whatever he was hiding, she decided she would learn it in time. From him, when he was ready. Because some things, once you've grabbed at them and watched them break, you learn to hold gently. "Good night, Tor," she said, rising. "Good night, Rosa." She went inside. The door shut. But it did not this time sound like a cell locking. It sounded like a door she might one day soon choose to walk back out of. And in the dark. Yard alone, the king who was pretending to be no one looked up at the same cold stars and let himself feel for the first time in 20 years something that was almost hope. He did not know that in a lined vest folded on a chair inside that house, his secret had already been found. He did not know she was watching. He only knew that the thread he'd told himself was nothing had pulled him 1,000 miles to a woman with rope-torn hands, and that whatever came next, whatever it cost him, whatever crown he had to set down or take up again to have her, he was never, as long as he drew breath, going to let her kneel in the mud again. Whatever came next, and a great deal was coming. The gossip did not stay gossip. That was the trouble with a small village. Words had nowhere to go but around and back again, gathering weight each time they passed a mouth. By the 7th week, What had begun as two women falling silent at the well had become a thing spoken openly in the market square, and by the 8th it had reached the one place Rosa had prayed it wouldn't. It reached Hedda. Rosa knew the moment she stepped into the house that evening. She could feel it, the way you feel a storm before it breaks a pressure in the air, a stillness that isn't peace. Her mother sat at the table, not working, just sitting, hands folded, waiting. "Sit down," Hedda said. Rosa didn't. "They're saying," her mother began, in that terrible calm voice she used only when she was truly furious, "that my daughter has made herself the entertainment of this village, that she spends her days with a landless drifter, that she's so starved for a man's attention she'll take it from a beggar." "He fixed our roof," Rosa said. "You slept dry all winter because of him." "I slept dry because you shamed us to a stranger," and there it was. The turn Rosa had waited her whole life to stop expecting and never had. Her sisters came the next day, both of them this time. Perrin and Wyla arriving in their good shawls, like two well-fed cats who'd found something small and wounded to circle. "Mother's beside herself," Perrin said, settling onto the bench without being asked. "She hasn't slept. You've made her the talk of every kitchen in Ashmere." "She's made herself that," Rosa said, "by telling everyone." Wyla laughed. "Listen to you. Sharp all of a sudden. Is that what he's done, taught you to talk back?" Rosa said nothing. She kept her hands moving over the mending small, even stitches, in and out, the rhythm that kept her steady when everything else wanted to shake. "You should be grateful," Perrin went on. 27 Rosa. No dowry, no prospects. Most women your age, with your situation, would be glad of any man. But a drifter. She shook her head, mournful, delighted. "It's not even that you married low. It's that you married nothing." And Rosa, who had swallowed 10,000 cruelties in her life, who had learned that swallowing was cheaper than fighting, felt something crack loose in her chest. "He is not nothing," she said. The words came out quiet, but they came out. Both sisters stopped, because Rosa did not say things like that. Rosa apologized. Rosa smoothed things over. Rosa made herself small so the rest of them could feel large. That was the arrangement. That was how the house had always balanced. And she'd just refused to hold up her end. "High is not nothing," she said again, and this time she looked up from the mending and her eyes were dry and level and terribly calm. "And I won't sit here and let you tell me he is. So you can carry that back to Mother if you like. Tell her I said it." Wyla's mouth opened, closed. Perrin stood gathering her shawl with the wounded dignity of a woman denied her sport. "You'll regret this," she said, "when he leaves, and he will leave. Men like that always do." They went, and Rosa sat alone in the quiet, hands trembling now that no one was there to see them, and thought maybe he'll leave. Because everyone kept saying it, and everyone in her life had always eventually been right about the bad things. But she thought of the silver seal sewn into his lining, the weight of it, the wolf pressed into the metal head high. And she thought a man who leaves doesn't sew a secret into his clothes and carry it 1,000 miles. A man who leaves has nothing to protect. What Rosa did not know was how close the man she was defending came that same week to putting the whole village behind him. Because far to the north, past the last of the poor farms, and into the broken country, where the border markers had been deliberately smudged, Aldrich Thorne found what he'd come for. He'd taken work with a trader hauling goods to the boundary settlements. It was a good cover. A laborer sees everything and is seen by no one. And what he saw turned his blood to cold iron. meeting grounds where the scent of wolf and the scent of man mingled and lingered. Fragments of silver-tipped bolts left carelessly in the brush, the kind of weapon forged for one purpose only. Territorial stones knocked flat or turned or blackened. Corwin Voss was not merely allowing the hunters through his lands. He was hosting them. He was the door, and the man on the other side of that door had a name. Aldrich heard it first from a rogue's careless mouth around a low fire, and then again, carved into a hunter's blade, left behind in the mud. Garrick Malden, a human. Once a border officer by the talk, a man who'd worn a uniform and sworn an oath, and then turned both to smoke. It was Malden who moved the silver. Malden who paid the rogues. Malden who was stitching a wolf-killing army together thread by thread in the dark. And the thing, they were building a compact between human mercenaries and rogue wolves, an alliance to gut the old pack law. From the inside was still young, still fragile. Still, if a king moved carefully, something that could be pulled apart before it hardened. But it needed watching. It needed weeks more of quiet observation of names and faces and routes, committed to memory, and passed south in coded notes carried by merchants to the ravens that flew them to Haldor at the palace, which meant staying, which meant more lies to the woman he'd married in his heart, if not yet in law. He stood in that ruined country with the evidence of a conspiracy at his feet, and he did the sum that every leader eventually has to do and hates. Duty on one side. On the other, a woman with rope-torn hands, who was at that very moment being torn apart by her own family for the crime of loving him. And then the sum got worse. Because as he traced the hunters' movements, the paths they favored, the settlements, they'd marked the villages that sat undefended in the widening shadow of what was coming. One name rose up out of the map and stopped his heart. Ashmere. The village was in the path. His mate was in the path. The realization hit him with a force that nearly buckled his knees. Not a scholar's worry. A wolf's. Every instinct he owned turned at once from the mission to her roaring, demanding he run south this instant and put his own body between Rosa and every blade in the north. He didn't run. He made himself not run, which was the hardest thing he'd done in 20 years of ruling. Because if he broke cover now, the conspiracy scattered. It went underground, regrouped, struck later, harder, somewhere he wouldn't see it coming, and Ashmere would burn anyway, only without him there to stop it. So he stayed in his lie a little longer, and he began quietly to plan a war. There was a night near the end of the 10th week that Rosa would remember for the rest of her life. They were sitting on the porch steps, the two of them watching the dark come down over the fields. She'd been telling him about a book she'd read as a girl, a borrowed thing returned before she could finish it, about a warrior who fell in love with a healer, and there was a wistfulness in her voice that she couldn't quite keep out. "Do you believe in that?" he asked. "Love that changes people?" She was quiet a long time. "I used to." Her eyes stayed on the fields. "When I was young, I thought someone would come and see past all of it. The failure, the poverty, the—" She stopped, shook her head. "But that's a child's idea. Life doesn't work that way." "What if it does?" She turned to look at him. "What if someone already sees past all of it?" he said, and something in his careful, guarded composure gave way, a crack running through it, like ice over a river in spring. "What if someone looks at you and sees strength where they told you there was failure, sees worth where they told you there was burden?" Her breath caught. Tore. "I know I'm no one." The words were coming now faster than he could weigh them. "I know I've got nothing to give you but work, and whatever a wanderer can put between you and the world. But I see you, Rosa. I see who you actually are. Not the thing they've spent your whole life trying to convince you that you're supposed to be." The air between them went taut, charged, alive. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you care about someone like me? Because you're my mate. Because my wolf knew you the moment I saw you. Because every instinct I own has been screaming your name for 10 weeks, and I have to bite it back every hour of every day he couldn't say it. So he reached out slow, giving her every chance to pull away, and covered her hand with his. Because caring about you," he said, "is the easiest thing I've done in years." She didn't pull away, and in the dark, with her hand warm under his, and the stars coming out. One by one, Rosa thought about the seal again. She thought now. Ask him now. He's cracked open, he'll tell you. Ask him who he is. She opened her mouth and closed it, because she was afraid. Not that the answer would be terrible, but that it would be true, and that the truth would take him somewhere she couldn't follow. Whatever that silver wolf meant, it meant a life, a place, people who knew his real name. And a woman like her did not belong in a life large enough to need a seal. So she said nothing. She let herself have the night instead. They would both later wish they'd spoken. The thing she'd been afraid to ask, she finally asked 11 days later. And it was the seal itself that made her. It happened by accident, the way the most important things always do. A rider came through Ashmere at dusk. Not a merchant, Rosa knew the merchants. This was a lean man on a good horse, cloaked, asking low questions at the tavern, and the word he was asking about caught in the evening air and drifted to her where she stood at the edge of the square. The king. She shouldn't have listened. She listened. The silent moon the rider was saying. The king of Vale, gone into his sacred solitude near 3 months past, and no word since, and some in the capital growing restless with the quiet. A month the rite was meant to last. It had been 3. Where was he? Where had the Mountain King gone? 3 months. Rosa stood very still in the falling dark, because a wanderer had come to Ashmere 3 months ago, with a tired horse and calloused hands, and a silver wolf sewn into his lining. And a king had disappeared 3 months ago into a solitude that no one could see. She told herself it was foolish. She told herself the world was full of coincidences, and full of silver, and full of men on tired horses. She told herself a dozen sensible things all the way home, and not one of them stuck, because underneath the sensible things was a certainty she'd been carrying for weeks and refusing to name. She found him in the yard, splitting the last of the wood. "Who are you?" He stopped, the axe half raised. He set it down slowly. "Rosa. I found the seal." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later, how steady it stayed. "Weeks ago. In your vest when I mended it. Silver. A wolf. I put it back and I said nothing because I thought you'd tell me when you were ready." A breath. "You're not a drifter. A drifter doesn't carry that. So I'm asking you plainly once, and I want the truth. Who are you?" For a long moment he said nothing at all. She watched the war move across his weathered face. Watched him weigh it. She could see the weighing, and it frightened her more than anything, because a simple man had nothing to weigh. "I can't tell you all of it," he said finally. Quiet. Rough. "Not yet. I want to. God knows I want to. But there are things happening, dangerous things that would put you in danger if you knew them, and I need a little more time before I can lay it all down in front of you." So you are someone. I'm someone. Someone with a name that isn't Tor. A pause. Yes. Rosa let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 11 weeks. She should have been angry. Some part of her knew that a wiser woman would be angry. He'd let her fall in love with a name that wasn't his, a life that wasn't real. She had every right to the fury her whole family would have felt in her place. But she looked at him, at the exhaustion in him, and the fear, not for himself, but for her plain on his face, and she understood something that the wiser woman would have missed. He wasn't hiding to use her. He was hiding to protect her. And no one, not once in 27 years, had ever tried to protect Rosa Vane from anything. When you can tell me, she said slowly, will you? I swear it. All of it. The name. The seal. Whatever's so dangerous it's aged you 10 years since spring. All of it. On my life. She nodded once. Then I'll wait, she said. I've waited for worse things than the truth. But Torsi, she stepped closer and she made him meet her eyes. I'm choosing this with my eyes open. Whatever you are, I want that understood. When the day comes and you tell me you don't get to say I didn't know what I was doing. Because I do. I know I'm choosing a man with secrets. I'm choosing him anyway. Something broke open in his face. It was the thing he'd wanted, and hadn't dared hope for to be chosen not in spite of his mystery, but through it, with clear eyes by a woman who saw the locked door and decided to stand beside it, rather than break it down. You are. And his voice was not entirely steady. The bravest person I have ever known, and I have known warriors. I'm not brave, she said the old answer, the true one. I'm just done being afraid of the wrong things. There was one more piece, and it came the way the worst pieces do, sideways from someone who didn't mean to give it. Rosa's mother, in a fury she couldn't fully hide, let something slip. It was a small thing. They were arguing again, always arguing now. Hedda circling the old ground. The disgrace, the drifter, the shame Rosa had brought down on all their heads. And Rosa, worn thin, said the thing she'd never dared to say. Why do you hate me so much? She expected the usual. The list. The failures, the burden, the father's eyes. Instead, her mother went still. And something crossed Hedda's face that Rosa had never seen there. Not anger. Something underneath the anger older, and for one unguarded second, terribly sad. I don't hate you, Hedda said, low, almost to herself. I'm teaching you. The same thing I learned. The hard way. Before you were ever born. Learned what? But the shutter came down. The moment closed. Her mother turned away, and the coldness rushed back in to fill the space where the sadness had been. And she said sharp as ever, that the world takes everything from women like us, and the only mercy is not to want anything, so there's nothing left to lose. She left the room, and Rosa stood there shaken, turning the words over. The same thing I learned. Before you were ever born. Because for one moment, just one, her mother had not been a monster. She'd been a woman with a wound. A woman who had somewhere in a past Rosa had never once thought to imagine been on the other side of a cruelty, just like the one she now dealt out daily. Rosa didn't forgive her. Not then. It was far too soon for that, and too much. But something moved. A small cold door opened onto a room she'd never known was there. She filed it away, the way she filed everything, and she did not yet understand that she'd just been handed the key to the deepest lock in her mother's heart, and in time to the freeing of her own. They were hand-fasted 4 nights later. It was small, It was quiet. A clearing in the woods that Rosa loved, the one place she'd always gone to breathe, and the full moon overhead, and an old widow from the far cottages who knew the words and could speak them so that the binding was true under wolf law. He took her hands. He spoke the old words, the ancient ones, and Rosa spoke them back, and if her voice shook, it was not from doubt. The moon poured down silver over both of them, and when he drew her in and kissed her, she felt through no magic she could name, only the plain truth of her own heart, that she had come home. That whatever he was, whatever name lived under the name he'd given her, this was real. This was the realest thing she had ever touched. What she couldn't feel, what the iron collar kept locked away from her, though it screamed inside him, was the bond itself. The mate bond, snapping taut between two souls that would have told her everything the seal only hinted at. He felt it. She didn't. He kissed his wife under the full moon, and knew with a guilt that sat in him like a swallowed stone that he had married his mate while wearing another man's face. And he swore to the silver moon that he would make it right. Soon. He almost had the time. 2 nights after the hand-fasting, the coded word came through the merchant lines, and it changed everything. Corwin Voss was dying, and Voss had learned no one knew how exactly who the wandering laborer in the north truly was. He wanted to confess before the end. Names, dates, Malden. The whole shape of the conspiracy laid bare by a dying man who wanted his soul lighter than his sins. It was everything Aldrich had spent 3 months trying to assemble, offered up in a single deathbed. He could not refuse it. To refuse it was to let the conspiracy live. He found Rosa in the gray light before dawn and told her he had to go. A few days, he said. A matter to the north, a debt to settle, nothing more. He hated the lie, even as it left his mouth, hated it more than any lie he'd told, because he'd just sworn on his life to tell her the truth. And here he was already spending that oath. A few days, he said. I'll come back for you. I swear it. She looked at him a long moment, and she surprised him the way she was always surprising him. Come back, she said. Not be safe. Not don't lie to me. Just come back. That's all I want. Everything else can wait. He kissed her forehead. He rode north into the dark, and he did not know, could not have known that even one day was one day too many, because his mother-in-law had been waiting for exactly this, for him to be gone, for Rosa to be alone, for the moment when the man who stood between her daughter and the old familiar smallness would be somewhere far away and unable to stop what came next. Voss did not last the 3 days Aldrich had braced for. The old Alpha spent his final hours emptying himself of every secret, the meeting sites, the payments, the rogues who'd sworn to Malden. And one thing more, the thing that turned Aldrich's careful patience to ice the attack, was not months away. It was days. Malden had chosen a soft target to blood his new army on a village with no strong Alpha to defend it. He'd chosen Ashmere. Aldrich was already in the saddle before the body was cold, riding south, harder than he'd ridden in 20 years, the mate bond in his chest pulling like a hook behind the ribs, and he arrived not in the 3 days he'd promised, but in barely more than 1, and rode into the middle of a nightmare. Because Hedda had not waited quietly. She'd chosen the square. She'd chosen midday when the market was full. She'd chosen an audience because an audience was the point. A private shaming teaches one person a lesson, but a public one teaches a whole village where a woman belongs. She dragged the whole ugly truth of it into the light. The hand-fasting, the moon, the disgrace done without her word, without witnesses she approved of, to a man with no name and no land and no proof he'd even stay, and she made her daughter kneel. Rosa knelt in the mud of the square, while her mother circled her, and the village watched, and it was every nightmare she'd ever had made real. And the man who'd promised to come back was somewhere on the northern road, and did not know. 27 years old, Hedda announced to the crowd, and so desperate, she married a vagrant. But here is the thing the village did not expect. The thing Hedda did not expect. The thing that no one in Ashmere had ever once seen Rosa Vane do. Kneeling there in the cold mud, with 200 eyes on her and her mother's voice slicing the air. Rosa put one hand flat against the ground, and she pushed herself up, slowly, alone, without a hand held out to help her, because there was no hand, because he wasn't there. She rose out of the mud on her own 2 feet, and she lifted her chin, and she looked her mother in the eye, and the whole square went silent at the sheer wrongness of it. The daughter who would not stay down. "I'm not desperate," Rosa said. "Quiet, carrying. I was chosen. There's a difference. You just never learned it." The crowd murmured, uncertain now, the spectacle turning strange in their hands. And it was in that exact moment, the woman on her feet, the mother pale, the whole village holding its breath, that steady, unhurried footstep sounded at the edge of the square, that the crowd began again to part. That a man with pale hair and a weathered face and pale blue eyes, the color of ice over deep water, came walking home into the middle of his wife's humiliation and saw her standing. Standing, not kneeling, having gotten up all by herself. And something in his face when he saw it, when he understood what she'd done, that she hadn't waited to be rescued, that she'd risen on her own before he ever arrived. Something in his face broke and remade itself into something the village had no name for, because they were about to learn what he was. All of them. Right now. He crossed the square slowly. The crowd fell away on either side of him, the way water falls away from the prow of a ship, and he did not hurry, because a man who hurries is a man who's afraid. And Aldrich Thorne had stopped being afraid of anything the moment he saw his wife standing on her own 2 feet in the mud. He came to a stop before Hedda. "I came to speak with you about your daughter," he said. Even, quiet. "Though I see you've decided that public shame suits you better than a private word." Hedda drew herself up. She'd built this whole spectacle on one assumption, that he was gone, that he'd fled, that a man like him always ran when the reckoning came. And here he was, which meant she had to win the harder way in front of everyone, and she was a woman who'd never lost an audience in her life. "You seduced my daughter," she said. "I asked her to marry me." His voice carried without effort, now reaching the last row of the crowd. She said yes. We were hand-fasted under the full moon with the old words spoken true. I understand that's not how it's done here. Where I come from, the moon's blessing means more than an elder's signature. And where is that? Hedda's laugh was ugly. Where do you come from? Months you've been here, and not one word of your family. Your history. Why a man your age wanders alone with no name worth speaking. For all we know, you're a criminal. A deserter. I'm neither. You're nothing. She spat it. You call her worth protecting because you're desperate the same as her. My daughter is a burden I've tried for years to be rid of. She's plain. She's old. She's worthless because her father's failures beggared this family before she was old enough to understand what poverty even was. The words landed on Rosa like they always had, like stones, even now, even standing. But she did not go back down, and Aldrich turned his head and looked at his wife, and then he looked back at Hedda. And when he spoke again, there was something new underneath the calm, something that made the wolves in the crowd shift and glance at one another uneasy without knowing why. "You've said your piece," he said. "Now I'll say mine. And then this village is going to learn exactly what it stood by and watched today." He reached up to his own throat, and he took off the iron collar. It was like the sun coming up inside a closed room. The collar hit the mud, and the thing it had caged for 3 months came free all at once, an alpha aura so vast, so absolute, that it rolled across the square like a physical tide. It was not merely strong, it was sovereign. The kind of presence that only comes from an unbroken line stretching back centuries from blood that had ruled mountains, when this village was still a clearing in the trees. Every wolf in the square went to their knees. They didn't choose it. Their bodies chose for them. The market women dropped where they stood. The men who'd laughed about the mountain husband folded like grass in a gale. Hedda's legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the dirt. She'd forced her daughter to kneel in her face, the color of ash, her mouth working around a word that wouldn't come. Only 2 people in the whole square did not fall. One was Aldrich himself, standing at the center of the storm he'd unleashed, tall and terrible, and finally fully himself. And the other was Rosa, because the bond had just come free. The collar had blocked it for 3 months. The mate bond, the deep and ancient thread that should have told her everything, the silver seal only whispered. And the moment the iron struck the ground, it snapped into place with a force that stole the breath from her lungs. His true scent hit her all at once, no longer smothered by magic, cedar, and winter frost, and something older than either, something that smelled like home, and had always smelled like home, she just hadn't been allowed to know it. Her hand flew to her chest, because she could feel him now. Feel him the way you feel your own heartbeat once someone points it out, always there. Impossible to unhear. The bond poured through her, filling rooms in her soul she hadn't known were empty, and it was not attraction, and it was not even love. It was recognition. It was destiny, settling into every cell of her body and saying at last, "There you are. There you have been all along." She swayed. She did not fall. She looked at the man she'd married, the stranger she'd chosen, with her eyes open, and she understood before he said a single word that the door she'd chosen to stand beside had just swung open, and behind it was a kingdom. "My name," he said into the ringing silence, "is Aldrich Thorne." He said it to the crowd, but he was looking at her. "I am the Alpha King of Valemore. I came here 3 months ago in the guise of a wanderer to investigate reports of hunters and rogues conspiring against the Northern Territories. I found that conspiracy." A pause. His voice gentled. It was the gentling that undid her, because it was Tor's voice, her Tor, inside this king's terrible calm. "But I also found something I had stopped believing existed. I found my true mate, my destined Luna. And I married her before I ever told her what I was, because I needed her to choose the man, not the crown." The silence held for 1 heartbeat. 2. Then Hedda found her voice cracked and disbelieving from where she sat in the mud. "You're the king." "Yes." His eyes never left Rosa. "And your daughter, the one you called worthless, the one you made kneel in the dirt, is the Luna Queen of Valemore. She always was. You were simply too small to see it. Tears were running down Rosa's face now, and she didn't wipe them. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The bond. All this time it was there, and I couldn't." "The collar hid it," he said gently. "From you, never from me. I have felt it every hour, since the road, since the water buckets, since the first moment. That's what I couldn't tell you. That's the danger I was keeping off your doorstep." He took a step toward her. "I'm sorry I lied. I'm not sorry I let you choose me blind. Because now you know whatever I feel for you has nothing to do with crowns or duty. I chose you as a man. You chose me as a man. The rest is just what happens to be true." And Rosa, who had spent 27 years being told her worth by people who never bothered to look, took the last step herself and put her hand against his chest over the bond, over the heart. She could feel beating in time with her own. But the world did not give them the moment, because the world had other plans that night. The first howl came from the north, then another, then a third layered under it. Wrong, not the loose music of a hunt, but the tight, deliberate pattern of wolves moving in formation. Aldrich's head snapped up, and the softness went out of him like a candle pinched dead, and the king came fully forward in his face. He knew that pattern. He'd been tracking it for 3 months. Malden had come. "Inside," Aldrich said, and it was not a request. It was the voice of a man who had commanded armies, and the whole square felt it in their spines. "Every door barred, every child under a roof. Now." They ran. The market emptied. Doors slammed. But Rosa did not run. She caught his arm. "How many?" "Enough. Rosa, go inside." "How many, Aldrich?" He looked at her, and he saw that she was not going to be told. Not tonight. Not ever again. And some part of him, the exhausted, guilty, hoping part, loved her so fiercely. In that instant, it hurt. "A dozen rogues," he said, "maybe more, and hunters behind them with silver. This village has no fighters, no walls, no time." "Then it has me," Rosa said. And she turned and she started shouting. Not the way her mother shouted to make people small. She shouted the way a woman shouts who has spent her whole life keeping a household of frightened people alive, on nothing, with orders, with a plan, with a steadiness that reached into panic and gave it something to hold. The old widow's cottage, stone-walled deepest in the village, that was where the children went, and she sent them there, in a chain, hand to hand. The elderly who couldn't run, she had the strong ones carry. The well, the water, the wet blankets, against fire and silver flame. She remembered the well, she'd carried its water 10,000 times, and now she turned that knowing into a shield. She put her own sisters to work, Perrin and Wyla, white-faced and obeying for the first time in their lives. Because in a crisis, people follow whoever is not afraid, and Rosa Vane, at last, was not afraid. Aldrich watched her for 1/2 second longer than he should have. Then he turned, and he shifted, and he became the thing he truly was. It happened between one stride and the next, bone and muscle, reforming pale hair flowing into fur like spun silver in the moonlight. His wolf was enormous, half again the size of any wolf the village had ever seen. Ice-blue eyes burning with a mind behind them. This was the form that had held Valemor's borders for 20 years and never lost. And it put itself without hesitation between the rogues and the woman organizing his people behind him. The first rogue broke the tree line and died before it understood it had made a mistake. What followed was not a battle. It was a lesson in why the old bloodlines had ruled so long. Aldrich moved through the rogues like weather, like consequence, herding them always away from the cottages, away from the water, churn, away from her. 2 fell. Then 3, the rest feeling for the first time what they'd truly agreed to serve under, began to break. And from the west came the men. Garrick Malden at their head, a lean, scarred man with a crossbow already rising silver-tipped, and eyes that had done cold arithmetic his whole life. Aldrich shifted back between one breath and the next, standing human and unafraid in the torchlight. "Corwin Voss is dead," he said. "He confessed everything before the end. Your name, your silver, your little war. It's over Malden. You've lost. The only question left is how." Malden didn't lower the bow, but something flickered behind the scars. Not fear. Something older and more tired than fear. "You think I did this for money?" His voice was rough, and it carried a grief in it that no one expected. "I wore your crown's uniform for 18 years. Border guard. I held a line your council forgot existed. And when the rogues came through the gap, your map said didn't exist, I sent for help that never came. I buried a garrison. I buried my own brother." The bow trembled just slightly. "Your kingdom decided some lives at the edge weren't worth the ride. So I decided to teach it what the edge could do. And there it was. Not a monster. A wound the same as Hedda, was a wound the same as half the cruelty in the world, was a wound that had learned to bite." The silence stretched. "Then you know," Aldrich said quietly, "exactly what it feels like to be counted as nothing by people who never bothered to look. And you chose to do it to a village full of people, even smaller than you were." He did not raise his voice. "Your grief is real. It does not buy you their children." Malden fired. Aldrich was already moving faster than a human eye could track the bolt passing through the space where his heart had been. His hand closed on a fallen branch, and his power poured into it until the wood rang like iron, and then he was among them. It ended quickly, not with slaughter, with precision bones and weapons, and the sense, knocked out, of trained men who had never once faced something built the way he was built. Within minutes, the hunters who could still stand had dropped their blades and raised their hands, and Garrick Malden was on his knees in the mud, with the king's makeshift weapon at his throat. Aldrich looked down at him, and he did not kill him. "You'll stand trial," the king said, "in the open, every name spoken aloud, and the failures at the border that made you, those will be spoken aloud, too. Both truths in the same room. That's more justice than either of us got the first time." It was not mercy Malden expected. It was perhaps worse for him, and better. He bowed his head, and he let them bind his hands. Dawn came gray and gold over Ashmere, and with it came Haldor the king's beta, and 50 riders of the royal guard in silver-crested armor, summoned by the emergency raven. Aldrich had loosed from Voss's deathbed. They rode into a village that had, against every expectation, held its children safe, its wounded few, its enemies bound in the square. Haldor took in the scene. The bound hunters, the dead rogues, his king in borrowed clothes alive, and a woman in a mended dress moving among the injured with wet cloths, and a steadiness that made hardened guards step aside for her, without being told. Haldor swung down from his horse and crossed to the king, right fist rising to press flat against his heart, the old salute, given only to sovereigns. Behind him, 50 guards did the same, a rustle of armor like a single indrawn breath. "Your Majesty," Haldor said, and the whole village watching understood at last that there was no trick, no boast, no lie left to hope for. The royal guard did not press their fists to their hearts for wandering laborers. "The situation's held," Haldor said, rising, his eyes still moving over his king for wounds. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." Aldrich's gaze had already gone past him to Rosa, wringing a bloodied cloth into a basin, tucking a blanket around an old man's shoulders. And Haldor, who had known his king for 30 years, and never once seen him look at anything the way he was looking now, went very still. "So it's true," Haldor said quietly. "You found her." "I found her." Aldrich's voice held something the Beta had never heard in it before. "Haldor, meet Rosalind Thorne, my wife, my mate, your Luna Queen." Haldor crossed to her, and this most senior warrior of Valemore lowered himself to one knee before a poor woman in a mended dress, fist over his heart. "Your Majesty, the kingdom has waited a long time for you." Rosa looked down at him, at the gray in his beard, the scars on his hands, the plain sincerity in his weathered face, and she found her voice, and it did not shake. "Please stand," she said. "I'm still learning what all of this means, but I won't have you kneeling in the blood of people you rode all night to save." Haldor stood, and something in his eyes said she had just passed a test he hadn't known he was giving. It was in the last of the morning, while the guards secured the prisoners, that the two reckonings Rosa had carried her whole life came at last to her door. Her father came first. Alden Vane crossed the square, slowly, hat crushed in both hands, looking smaller and older than she had ever seen him. He stopped an arm's length away, and could not for a long moment meet her eyes. "I failed you," he said. "No preamble, no excuse. Your mother, she was strong and I was tired, and I told myself keeping the peace was the kind thing. It wasn't. It was the coward's thing. I stood by while she taught you that you were nothing. And I let her." His voice cracked. "I'm not telling you this because you're a queen now. I'd have owed you these words if you'd stayed poor your whole life. You always had worth. I was just too weak to guard it." He reached into his coat and drew out a small leather pouch, soft with age. "This was your grandmother's. She left it to you. Your mother hid it away the day she died." He pressed it into Rosa's hands. "It's not much. A few coins. Her ring. But it was yours, and I should have given it to you 17 years ago." Rosa held the pouch, and she wept not for the coins, but for the 17 years, and for the man who had finally too late found the shape of the word Ori. "I don't ask forgiveness," Alden said. "I don't deserve it. I only wanted you to hear it once out loud. You're going to be an extraordinary queen. You were always going to be extraordinary. We just weren't brave enough to say so." He left before she could answer. Some men only find their voice when it's too late to use it well, but they find it, and that finding matters even so. And then there was her mother. Hedda had not fled during the fighting. She stood now at the edge of the square, apart from everyone, her fine, borrowed dress ruined with mud, her whole architecture of superiority collapsed around her feet. She did not look triumphant. She did not look angry. She looked for the first time in Rosa's memory, simply old and afraid, and terribly unbearably tired. Rosa walked to her. She did not have to. That was the thing she understood crossing that distance, that she was a queen. Now that 50 warriors would carry out any word she spoke, that she could turn her back on this woman forever, and no one alive would blame her. She walked to her anyway. "I don't hate you," Rosa said. It was the thing her mother had once said to her, handed back. "I want to understand you. You said you learned it. The hard way. Before I was born. What did you learn?" And Hedda Vane, stripped of every weapon, told her. The words came out in pieces ugly, and halting a story never spoken aloud in 30 years. A girl once in a village much like this one, poorer even. A girl called plain and old and a burden. A girl who had loved someone who'd left and been shamed in a square much like this one, and been taught by her own mother's hand that the only mercy was to want nothing, to expect nothing, to make herself so small that the world couldn't find enough of her to break. "I looked at you," Hedda whispered, and she could not lift her eyes. "And I saw a girl who still hoped, who still wanted things. And I thought I was saving you. I thought if I broke it out of you early, the world couldn't do it later, and it would hurt less coming from me." A terrible sound. I told myself that for 27 years, that I was being kind. God forgive me. I was just passing it on. The same wound, handed down. Because no one ever stopped it, and I didn't know a person could. The square was silent, and Rosa stood before the woman who had spent a lifetime making her small, and she felt the old rage, and under it now, something the rage had never let her feel before. Grief. For her mother. For the girl her mother had been. For the unbroken chain of it, mother to daughter to daughter. Each one taught the same cruelty by someone who called it love. "You were wrong," Rosa said, gently. It was the gentleness that cost her the most. "You were wrong about all of it. But you didn't invent it. Someone did this to you, and you passed it to me. And if I had a daughter and stayed silent, I'd pass it to her." She drew a breath. "So it stops. Here, with me. Not because you've earned it, you haven't, not yet, maybe not for years. I'm not doing this for you." She stepped closer, and she made her mother look at her. "I'm doing it because I refuse to carry it one more day. I'm setting it down, the whole weight of it. And I am walking out of this square without it." Her voice did not break. "That's what forgiveness is, Mother. It was never a gift I owed you. It's a door I'm walking through so that thing you handed me doesn't get to follow me the rest of my life." Hedda broke then. Not prettily. Not in a way that fixed anything. But truly a woman weeping for the child she'd been, and the child she'd wounded 30 years of frozen ground, cracking all at once. Rosa did not embrace her. It was too soon, and some wounds heal only across years if they heal at all. But she reached out, and she rested one hand on her mother's shoulder for one breath, the way you touch someone you have decided to stop hating. Then she turned, and she walked back toward the man waiting for her across the square, and she left the weight where it lay in the mud. She never picked it up again. The journey to Valemore took 3 days, and with every mile the poor thin country of the borderlands gave way to something greener, richer, kinder. And on the 3rd afternoon, the palace rose before her. Not a single building, but a whole city, carved into the living mountain towers, reaching for the sky waterfalls, throwing rainbows across the cliffs, ancient and beautiful and impossibly large. "This is home," Aldrich said, riding close to her carriage window. "You're home now. Home." The word felt like a coat cut for someone else's shoulders. How could a woman who'd grown up under a leaking roof ever fill a place like this? She soon learned exactly how hard it would be. The council was waiting, and the council was not pleased. 12 of them around a table of black stone faces ranging from curiosity to open contempt. Lord Emmerich, eldest of them, who had pushed the king toward marriage for a decade, looked as though he'd bitten something sour. "Your Majesty," he said, "while we rejoice that you've taken a mate at last, we must voice concern. A village woman, no noble blood, no connections, no training in governance. This is not what the throne requires." "It is precisely what the throne requires," Aldrich said, and the edge in it silenced Emmerich. I spent 3 months as a common wolf. I saw how our laws land on people with no power to soften them. She lived that her whole life. She understands what it is to be overlooked, dismissed, counted as nothing. That understanding is worth more than any bloodline in this room. Understanding hardship and governing a kingdom, said Lady Soren carefully, are different arts. Perhaps the Luna Queen might benefit from years of instruction before taking any active. I don't need her to benefit from anything, the king said coldly, except your respect. She is my mate, chosen by destiny itself. That makes her your queen. Any of you who cannot accept it may resign. The silence was heavy with judgment, and Rosa felt every eye on her, and it was Ashmere all over again, told she wasn't enough, would never be enough, needed to be hidden, or fixed, or changed. But she thought of a hand pulling her out of the mud. She thought of her own hand, flat against cold ground, pushing herself up before that hand ever came. And she found her voice. "You're right to be concerned," she said, and clearly enough that all 12 heard. The startled looks came fast. "I don't have noble blood. I wasn't raised to govern. I'll make mistakes you'd never make." She met each of them in turn. "But I was raised to survive cruelty, to find kindness in hard places, to see worth in the people everyone else steps over. And I learned one thing you cannot teach in any hall, that power, without compassion, is just tyranny wearing a crown." She let that settle. "I'm not here to replace what you do. I'm here to learn it, and to make certain this kingdom's strength always reaches the people who have none. If that frightens you, then perhaps His Majesty is right, and you should ask yourselves whether you still belong at this table." The silence that followed was different, thoughtful. Old Emmerich's contempt shifted by a degree into something that might one day become respect. "Well there," he said at last, "perhaps there's more to Her Majesty than first appears. Time will tell." Yes, Rosa agreed. It will. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life. Harder than her mother's cruelty. Harder than the square. Because for the first time she had something she was terrified to lose. She used the wrong fork at formal dinners and felt the noble's eyes catch the mistake. She sat through council meetings, understanding half the maneuvering. She heard the whispers. The king's little peasant. She'll shame the crown by winter. 3 weeks in, she broke sobbing against Aldrich's chest in the dark, certain she was failing. "You're not failing," he said. "You're learning. There's a difference." He tilted her face up. "I was 22 when I took this throne. Barely more than a boy, responsible for millions of lives. I failed constantly. I learned. I became the king. This kingdom needed, not because I was ever perfect, but because I refused to stop trying. Give yourself the grace you'd give anyone else. Destiny didn't choose you because you were already a queen. It chose you because you could become one." The turning came in the 6th week, and it came from the edge of the map, the same place all of this had begun. A delegation from the border packs, the ones the conspiracy had ravaged. At their head, a woman named Undine, gray-eyed and gaunt, from a pack half destroyed by rogue raids. She was explaining her people's plight when Lord Emmerich gave the standard answer resources allocated by protocol assessments, conducted options reviewed. Proper, diplomatic, utterly useless. Rosa watched the hope die in Undine's face. And she stood. She came down from the dais and crossed the floor and stopped directly in front of the woman, ignoring the council entirely. "Tell me what you actually need," she said. "Not what fits a report. What would keep your people alive this winter?" Undine stared, stunned to be addressed at all. Your Majesty, healers, we lost ours in the raids. And builders. Our homes are ash and the snow is coming. But most of all, her voice failed, then held. We need to know someone remembers we exist. Rosa turned to Emmerich. How long does protocol take to deliver help? 3 months, Your Majesty. Perhaps 4. Proper assessment requires. They'll be dead in 1, Rosa said, or scattered the pack dissolved exactly what Malden wanted and couldn't finish with silver. She looked to Aldrich. We keep royal healers, more than the palace needs. We do, the king said, and there was something fierce and proud rising in his face. And builders for the palace works. Yes, then they leave today. 5 healers, 10 builders, supplies enough for the whole pack to reach spring. Not in 3 months. She turned back to Undine. Today. Will that hold you? Undine's eyes flooded. Your Majesty, that would save us. Then it's done. Rosa faced the council, chin lifted. Unless someone objects. No one did. How could they? She'd solved in 5 minutes what they'd studied for a season, not with cleverness, but by doing the one thing none of them had thought to do. She'd listened. Word of it ran through the palace, then the kingdom. Petitioners began asking for the Luna Queen by name, because she heard them. She built things after that. A fund for widowed wolves, schooling for orphans, a standing relief order for any pack in crisis. So no one ever again had to wait 3 months to be told they mattered. The council stopped questioning her presence and started asking her opinion. The nobles stopped whispering about her origins and started seeking her favor. And slowly, the whole kingdom came to see what Aldrich had seen from a dusty road in the first hour, that her humble beginning was not the flaw in her. It was the source of everything that made her strong. 3 months after she came to Valemore, they crowned her. The great hall was full, and Aldrich placed the crown of silver and sapphire on her head with his own hands, and his voice carried to the last row. I present to you Rosalind Thorne, Luna Queen of Valemore, chosen by destiny, tested by hardship, proven by compassion. She will rule beside me, not because tradition demands it, but because this kingdom deserves a queen who knows what it is to suffer, to endure, and to rise. The applause was thunder. And in the front rows, Rosa saw faces she had earned, Undine healthy now on her feet. A widow whose children she'd put in school. Old wolves whose care she'd guaranteed with her own word. They weren't clapping from duty. They were clapping for the woman who had seen them. That night alone, Aldrich drew her close and pressed his forehead to hers. How does it feel? He asked. Like I'm finally home, she said. Not the crown, not the walls. I just found a place where I belong. You always belonged, he said softly. The world just needed time to catch up to what I saw from the start. And Rosalind Vane, who had spent 27 years being told she was worthless, who had knelt in the mud of a square, while a whole village watched, finally understood the truth she'd been kept from her whole life. She had always been enough. The lack had never been in her. It had been in the eyes of everyone who couldn't be bothered to look. But destiny had looked. Aldrich had looked. And now a whole kingdom looked and saw exactly what had been standing there, in a mended dress the entire time. A woman with the strength to endure, the wisdom, to learn, the courage to set down a weight she'd carried her whole life, and the compassion to lift in its place everyone the world had told to stay down. The wolf they had called worthless had become the queen they could not do without. And that, in the end was the truest justice of all.